Alright, so today I want to show you how to make a gray ball python. It's a pretty unusual color in ball pythons, and if you've ever actually seen a really intense gray ball python, it's a pretty breathtaking combination. And one of the ways you can do it is you can make the gray matter. You may have heard of the gray matter. It's actually a gray looking pie that you can make with the champagne. It's probably the best thing you can do with the champagne gene, but there's quite a few other ways that you can make some really intense gray looking ball pythons. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you several different ways that you can make a gray ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here at Morphmarket.com and I want to start with the gray snake that you're probably familiar with, and that is the gray matter. The gray matter is the combination of the champagne and the super cinnamon, kind of an interesting combination. And this is what a champagne looks like. The champagne is one of the more challenging genes to work with. It is extremely visually dominant. So a lot of times when you work other genes into the champagne, sometimes you'll get a completely patternless snake that's a slightly different color than a champagne. As a matter of fact, a lot of people ask me, hey, how can I make a patternless snake? And let me tell you, champagne is definitely the way to go to make some really cool, completely patternless combinations. And a lot of times you'll actually see a completely patternless snake. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of the pattern of the champagne coming through your combinations. And probably one of the coolest things you can do with champagne, if you're actually working with the gene, you can take the champagne and cross it with a pied, and you can get champagne het pieds. And it's kind of an interesting anomaly. For whatever reason, one copy of the recessive pied gene, when you work it into champagne, you actually get a visual pied effect in the champagne, which is kind of unusual. If you actually have two copies of the pied and make a real visual pied champagne, it's actually a completely white snake, which is kind of interesting. But probably one of the coolest things you can do with the champagne is to make the gray matter. And here is the super cinnamon. I actually pulled one up here. And kind of the interesting thing about this combination is the champagne is really visually dominant and the super cinnamon is also really visually dominant. You can actually work other genes into the super cinnamon, and a lot of times it'll mask all the other genes. And the super cinnamon can be really variable. Sometimes they can be kind of a light cinnamon brown color, and sometimes they can be almost jet black like this one. Pretty amazing. So here's what happens if you take the super cinnamon and work in the champagne. This is what you get. You get the gray matter. Take a look at this crazy snake. Essentially what this looks like, it actually looks like a visual pied with these big splotches of white through the snake. And it's kind of weird. A lot of genes you actually work into champagne and you get this visual pied effect, even though there's no pied genes in this combination. And you actually have the super cinnamon, which is really visually dominant. And then when that actually works with the champagne, you end up with this almost like a steel gray color from the super cinnamon combined with the champagne. Makes for a really impressive combination. So there's actually quite a few other ways you can make some really impressive gray snakes, and you can actually use pretty much any dark gene as a starting point. I actually pulled up the DJI. So the DJI is actually a dark gene and a pattern enhancer, and when we refer to dark genes, essentially what we're talking about is if you actually take a dark gene like the DJI and work it into other genes or other combinations, you'll actually darken the background of the snake. You can see in this one, it has really almost like an inkjet black background in some of these GHIs and really a jumbled up pattern. So you can actually take the GHI, and to take the GHI and turn it into a gray snake, the key is to mix in ghost. I actually pulled up a ghost over here. And when it comes to making gray snakes with a ghost, you kind of have to be careful as far as what version of the ghost that you use. So this is a ghost. This is recessive 2 copies of the ghost gene. And kind of the slang for ghost is hypo. Some people kind of use the terms interchangeable, hypo or ghost. And when it comes to ghost, there's actually certain lines that are really bright orange. There's actually a line called the orange ghost. If you actually take the orange line of ghost and work it into some of your dark genes, you don't really end up with a really intense gray. You get kind of an orange color that kind of defeats the purpose of a really intense gray looking snake. So really what you want is some of these ghosts look almost like normals that are kind of faded out. this one actually looks like it's almost gray to begin with, which is kind of interesting. So here's what happens if you take Hypo or Ghost and you mix it with DJI. This is what you get. You get a gray snake. This is pretty interesting. And you can actually, as gray as this one is, you can actually really improve on the appearance of this and make it really super intense as far as the gray color. And it's kind of interesting when you start thinking about gray snakes and the Ghost and the dark jeans. It seems like the darker the jean or the combination that you start with, the more intense gray that you get is a final product when you mix in the Ghost. So I actually pulled up another one over here with 2 copies of the DJI. So the Super DJI is even darker than 1 copy of the DJI. And when you actually mix Ghost into the Super DJI, take a look at this. You get an even steel gray snake. It's really super intense as far as the gray color, which is pretty awesome. And when you start thinking about dark jeans, you can use pretty much any dark jean as a starting point, going after the gray snakes, mixing the dark jean with the Ghost. And you can actually take, for example, I actually pulled one up over here. This is one of my favorite dark combinations. This is the combination of the Mojave and the DJI. Probably one of my favorite combos. It's kind of interesting. You actually see some of these Mojave DJIs and they have like an almost jet black side and a really bright, intense, kind of a dashed line right down the top. And if you've ever actually seen one of these in person, it doesn't even look like a real snake. It almost looks like a toy snake. It is a pretty amazing combination. Probably one of the best dark combos that I've actually ever seen. And you can actually add Ghost to this to turn it into a steel gray combination. So take a look at this. If you actually take the Mojave DJI and you add Ghost, this is what you get. Take a look at this crazy snake. I'd say this is probably one of the most intense gray snakes that I've ever seen over here on Morphmarket. It is pretty amazing. This is the DJI Mojave Hypo, or the Hypo is the same thing as the Ghost. It's pretty amazing. And it's kind of the weird thing about DJI Mojave, if you're actually working with the DJI Mojave, is one of the tricks you can use to make a different looking DJI Mojave. You can actually add pinstripe to the mix. And essentially what pinstripe does is it takes this dash line right down the top of the DJI Mojave and it turns it into a single solid line, and it makes it even more bright and intense, which is kind of interesting. I actually pulled up a pinstripe over here. If you're wondering what a pinstripe looks like, this is one of my favorite jeans. I actually produce quite a few pinstripes every year, and they actually, as hatchlings, they can look almost bright gold. It's pretty amazing. And a lot of the pinstripes will have a stripe right down the top, which is sometimes it's really visually dominant as far as the pattern of the pinstripe, working it into other combinations. So take a look at this combination. This is interesting. This is actually the combination of the DJI Mojave, which is the dark snake with the dotted line with the pinstripe on top. And look at what the pinstripe does to the DJI Mojave. It turns that dotted line, the dash line, into a solid line all the way down the snake. Pretty amazing combination. I say this is probably my second best combination. You know, the DJI Mojave, if I actually had that combination, I would definitely work it into pinstripe to make some of these. And to turn this into a gray snake, what you need to do is you need to add Ghost to the mix. So this is what happens if you add Ghost to the DJI Mojave pinstripe. Take a look at this crazy snake. That is probably one of my favorite snakes right there. It has a really intense yellow line right down the top of the gray snake. Pretty amazing combination. And essentially you can do this with any dark jeans. I actually put some up over here. So take a look at this. This is probably one of the blackest jeans that I've actually seen over here on Morphmarket. This is the Super Black Pastel. 2 copies of the Black Pastel. Makes it completely patternless. Probably the blackest snake that you can actually make with any jeans. And if you actually add Ghost to this, you turn it into a really intense gray snake. Take a look at this. This is the Super Black Pastel Hypo. Really crazy looking snake. And you can definitely tell in some of these are probably pretty expensive. So this one actually sold for $950. I didn't even look at the prices on this. So this is a little bit harder to hit because you actually have a super and a recessive in the same snake. Kind of a little bit more difficult. So it's 4 jeans in this combination. So So here's the last one I wanted to show you. This is actually the super blackhead. And when it comes to the darkest of the dark snakes, I'd say the blackhead usually has the greatest influence as far as darkening the visual appearance of a lot of your combinations. And if you actually make the super blackhead, you get a snake like this with a really super black background, almost like an inkjet background. And look at that, the black head on this, really super black. You can definitely tell this is one of the darkest blacks that you see in ball pythons. And here's what happens to the super blackhead if you add ghost to the mix. Take a look at this crazy snake. This is the super blackhead ghost. And some of these, it's almost like you really can't see the true appearance of the snake and the color and the contrast unless you actually see them in person. I've seen some of these pictures over here in Morphmarket, and let me tell you that the exposure and the contrast can vary quite a bit on these, but you can definitely tell this is a really super gray snake. And this one's kind of interesting too because it's a gray snake and it has a lot of colored pattern on the side, which you can actually mix in other genes into this combination. I think you can make some really bright colors on the side of a gray snake, which would be pretty awesome. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Mallory Marino asks, is it normal for my new ball python to strike at me after feeding? And that is a very good question. I'd say yes, it's pretty normal for ball pythons to kind of go into a feeding frenzy, especially after you feed them that very first rodent. And as a matter of fact, if you actually have a ball python that's a little bit underweight and you feed them like an appropriate size rodent, sometimes you can actually follow up with a second rodent. They kind of go into that feeding mode where it's easier to feed them. I think it's a little bit easier after you feed them one rodent to follow up and feed them a second one versus waiting a couple days to feed them a second one. Although if you feed them too many in a row, sometimes you can risk regurgitation, so you have to really be careful. And I would say you probably really want to be careful, especially after like a feeding session, going through your racks or your enclosures, feeding all your ball pythons. Sometimes I'll actually go through and just check to see if they've eaten the rodents, kind of looking through the racks, and sometimes they'll jump out and actually bite me. Sometimes they'll actually get me. You have to be pretty careful, especially after feeding with ball pythons, but I'd say in most cases, you can actually wait about 24 hours and they'll snap right out of that feeding mode. And generally, you really shouldn't handle them after a feeding anyways, because you can risk regurgitation. It's kind of hard on the snake. So I'd probably feed them. I'd probably wait at least 2 or 3 days before you pick them up. And by then, they'll definitely be out of the feeding mode in most cases. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.